Um, I have to introduce you, Ahmed, because not everybody
Yeah,
knows you yet.
yeah,
Um, so today in the roundtable seventh, we have Ahmed Isam Aldin, right?
yeah.
He is a visual artist and designer and blogger from Khartoum, Sudan. He studied physics at the University of Khartoum and graphic design and photography in Cairo. His practice focuses on the migration and psychology, as well as the process of revolutions, the colonial design and technology. He has participated in various exhibitions between Khartoum, Cairo, and Berlin, and he's currently studying visual communication at
Only
Western Kunsthalle Berlin. But you just graduate, right?
Yeah.
yeah, it's
So
not that.
maybe you
Yeah,
can update your current academic status.
I have to write. I gonna do that. I didn't update it yet because I'm just gonna start in
Yeah.
1 week. Yeah. So I'm currently a student in ODK, Universität de Kunst Berlin in the Kunst Media program. So exactly, that's just only change, a little bit change. I'm gonna do it later. Yeah.
Maybe we can start with like very generic questions about museum roles and how operational changes is expected in museum. Maybe with one of your quotes from your essay, you say that the art acquisition of museums is supposed to be inclusive. However, it often represents itself in the form of nation-state antique shop designed with a Eurocentric gaze. Contemporary creators introduce new approaches and objectives.
Mm.
Maybe you can elaborate what does new approaches means, like what are the
Yeah.
positive and negative aspects. And we really liked your description about
Yeah.
antique shop. It's
Yeah.
very brave.
Yeah, it is actually. I think that the article itself is also most of actually critics. It was just a part of it, an example of the historical conflict that took a place in the museum. But the article actually is even critics further the curatorial projects that would. It is not. This wasn't. This was just the first focus of it, like to criticize the old form of museum, which is represent kind of civilization of nation, and what the so-called civilization of nation, which is um, um, carrying this conscious of nation state, which is taking any kind of form of art and preserving it in the museum as setting like a proud, bringing in a nation identity to exposure and represent what you call it like history of within this imaginary border of that space to create sense of proudness or sense of it's like a sense of what you call it like national collective identity. And what is in is exactly what I was writing in that article. I was inspired by the work of Boris Groys. He's a German cultural critique and artist. Sorry, like artist critique and media critique. He talk about this transformation happen in museum from uh, from a space to preserve antiques or to preserve history to a place of movement. And I think this is a contemporary art movement happening through the 70s and 90s, which is introduced the curatorial projects, artistic projects inside the museum as to kind of there's no anymore universal definition of identity of collective identity. There is a social movement. The egalitarian movement of the 80s and the 70s have actually exposed that our there's nothing is called one nation with certain kind of hierarchical representations. There is a different identity that form coming to the surface. There is the nation itself doesn't. It's kind of the border of the nation is very blurry. Like for example, um, like who is the German and who is the Sudanese, and who is the Russian. It's all defined politically, but actually it is a space of movement, and this space of movement has to be represented on the museum. And that was this is kind of bringing that exposure, or bringing this new identity of like the movement, or present the movement in the museum space. I think that what is the presence has to be all the future as well. So basically, if I go to the Hermitage, for example, in St. Petersburg, I'm still looking at this, what do you call it, antiques. No, you have the nation state like Peter Berby and Peter First, which is used to be the palace of Peter the First, or Peter Berby in Russia, and then they kept the ground floor to be like, this is like Russian representation of the civilization history, the Tsar history, stuff like that. Even though the Russians have revolted against that in 1917, the October Revolution, and then you have they erased for sure all of the communist history, although this represents a very strong part of it. And then you have this universal art, which is represented as a guest inside the Hermitage, like the work of Pablo Picasso, or like an international artist in the second, third floor. And then you have the history of Greek and the history of Roman as represented. They have the space of the others represented within the center of Peter Berby and the Tsar. And so it's not anymore represent the current movement and conflict inside what is called Russia now, or the Eastern European fight, and also the history that created the space from storming the Hermitage of 1917, and then you have the transformation happening in the society. That what is a Russian is during the Soviet, there was a Kazakhstan, there was a Tajikistan, there was a Shishan, and they are kind of minority and they're kind of majority, and they're part of the Red Army and the Inter Berlin, and they are part of that history, and they are not represented on that space, even as minority or even as a movement in a way. And that kind of give an example of what is the museum is a stage of power, trying to tell us this is the nation and this is the history, and what is the conflict we had with the museum's form of fight. Either we burn them, the museum, because they are represent this kind of form of power, or we introduce this form of movement or social movement that we had, like this conflict that museum have to be currently in move. There is no antique, there is no preservations of certain kind of culture, because this is a representation of new forms of power. That was, I think, on that article that what I was actually talking about in this chapter. Yeah, but also I think it is just one point that the critique was actually to after that as well. So I'm looking more for the future. If like also this projects now to spaces and to museum, there is an opening the museums. If you see, go in Berlin, if you go in New York, if you go to all of the museum, they are opening a space what's called contemporary art. But the contemporary art as well is represent of kind of neoliberal privilege movement somehow, that talking about certain kind of topics and subjects that is still creating a power hierarchy within the within the society. So, for example, until now in US, for example, it is very complicated to talk about Arab identity within the war of terror. You could represent blackness, for example, but talk about the form of invasion in Iraq is very difficult, and that was happening. I think recently there was a conflict in MoMA, what do you call it, like the Museum of Contemporary Art, I think in New York, that there was a
Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah.
modern art. Sorry. So what's happening is kind of a scandal that in the internet there was a conflict.
I don't know. I
Yeah,
didn't follow that.
Yeah, this Iraqi artist. They've been coming to talk about the identity of war in Iraq. But then one of the people who is in the board of the MoMA is basically, or the main sponsor is also the sponsor of one of these, what they call it, proxy war companies that actually. And yeah, so basically there's many artwork that has been done on that in this conflict. I think most of the beautiful work I remember from Hitlerstein is like in the museum is a battlefield. I can actually just post a link to share it. It's a very very beautiful work. that bring this idea of what is a museum, even in the curatorial. So this is already, we are passing through that. We're not just criticizing the nation state and think this is a critique that exists, but also the curatorial contemporary art. What is a museum represent as power? What is the hierarchy inside? What is how is the funding system working? What is kind of class and class represented? What's kind of conflict of society that represented that space? What is contemporary art as well represent? But maybe we can elaborate more in the conversation. I think we have a form of technologies today that define the other in a very complicated way. So basically, the othering is vague. I can understand that the statement coming from that, we have a huge mass migrations, we have a lot of problem of economical, what do you call it, stagnation that come after the globalization of the 90s, and then you have a lot of people coming to the center of economy, so running to Europe or going to US, that transformed the identity. You have also colonialism era, which is kind of transformed the identity of big colonial wealthy nations like France and UK and also Germany and all of the European nation of like who is part of France. Is it Senegalese soldiers who fought in the war? All the time the definition is getting very, very complicated, but power relationship, or let's call it like the form of power, producing technology to define others. So we have the ID cards creation, the passports in the beginning of the what do you call it, the 19th century. It has to do with othering and monitoring, CIA, FBI, Germany against the Red Army fractions, all of this power relationship that we created technology to define the others, and the others is all the time. The definition of othering is a form of producing new kind of power, that it is not different than 200 years ago. Sorry, it's not like a vague than 200 years ago. It's just different. There's a new other coming to the form of like how I can sustain power by defining who is others. Now we have a new kind of, after I think after the Second World War, we have this definition getting complicated, because the Second World War this is the last, what you call it, massive war between nations, as we know, now and it was a form of sustaining power over the world and materials and resources, and the conflict was there. But now there is no like there is a need for creating the others as the small symbolic fractions of groups within the nation to define who is in the power is. And I think this is made it very complicated. After September 11, you have the Muslims others in US, for example, and then you have the minority others like the Kurdish others. You have the Southern Sudanese others, and then to have a kind of a low range or low scale or like smaller scale conflict that sustain power. And I think coming from Sudan, it's very clear now this is happening in Ethiopia. For example, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, they are fighting again as a nation state. They have a conflict over this dam, but there is no an actual conflict exists between the nation. The conflict is all the time internalized and defined within the others inside the nation. That make so the post-war on terror states and post also Second World states in a way that like they don't want to go in a massive nation state definition, because that the misery of it, the conflict, the bloody conflict was very horrible. Though, so it's basically let's define minorities inside our nation, and that represent all the time in the museum. I think I was talking to Amal before about Sudan is always represented in this Nubian, the Nile, Germany represented with Bismarck and the German nation, and so all of the minorities that excluded outside the museum space in the past where there was many of them, but now is very defined in who is outside working as a security in the museum, and when you enter the museum, who is not represented. You can see it is very lined between social and museum. So the statement is quite big, but it needs to be break down to details somehow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
No, but it's very interesting because I was also looking into this idea of representation and relationship with nation and identity. So in this article that was talking about architecture and identity,
Yeah.
they were mentioning how globalization created this idea of people wanting to define what is theirs in a more local context.
Yeah.
And so always with these definitions and identity, there's a way of, excluding others by, defining what is yours. And
Yeah.
so my question becomes here is that um, we talk about museums that are, generally as a part of the past, and you were saying also like, yeah, either we burn them or move forward. But for me is that how should, what do you think is the way for museums to move forward without, all of these, small issues of identity and othering? Like, what would be the role of museums, in the future?
Yeah. There's two points on that. I think it's also coming to that. I return back to this article I wrote to Migration to Pastorality. It was about digital spaces. So one of my problem in the article that curatorial art they are moving so fast in a way of defining the role of art and the role of museum and the role of exhibition spaces. So we have in 2020 the corona pandemic, and then you have this like digital technology offer, and then a lot of people want to move to virtuality very fast and see corona as experimental social a massive social experiment. What happened to us here?
I'm sorry,
Yeah, it's okay. It's funny.
I need to change it.
Yeah, it's
Skype
like
was
it's like
live, but
sitting in the park.
hopefully it doesn't
Uh,
show. Okay. So
yeah, so
continue.
this was one of the things that they actually created. I think that there was, I just from personal experience that as a designer, as a person who also worked with 3D, that I had a lot of orders of like, hey, let's create a project in a virtual reality spaces on this project. Let's make a museum. Let's replicate the museum on 3D and sculpting. And this was so fast transformation that without understanding what is so going to the future without criticizing the present, very, very, very. And so we'll talk about criticizing the present. Then I see the museum. Well, how I see the museum in the future is basically what I said in the beginning of the conversation. Is they need to grasp and you need to integrate the movement on it. So the museum cannot anymore preserve a static situation or conditions. It needs all the time to represent a constant movement that's happening, and that's what that's mean exactly is it is not basically saying, for example, in US and UK there's a lot of movement inside the museum to dismantle colonial legacy, and part of part of it I found it very good and interesting, but in the same time it is you see this form of othering is also is formed in a way that we just break down that history by replacing a sample of history that we think in our conscious and our reading they are the system of power. Like for example, what happened in Germany, they got this black philosopher, is known William Emmel, and then they give him a name of the street. They change the station. It's called Mohrenstraße, which is mean the black. It's like very racist term in Germany, like a station. Then they replace it by a black philosopher, German philosopher, to present that particular history. So I don't know if I think that the museum has to do that. Maybe public spaces to this scale, maybe to do that. I don't want to very stand
Yeah.
again, but but how we can grasp this moment of history, the fight itself to change the name. This is exactly what it has to be brought to, because you don't want to take the brutality of colonial history outside the history record, but you want to represent the fight and the conflict, and this you keep that continuous representation of an exist conflict, that movement all the time happening in the topics. So I was visiting the Hugina Museum on in Germany. Hugina Museum is a museum in Dresden, which is built shortly before the Nazi to teach the worker in the factories how to be hygienic. It's very like a control and surveillance of early industrial revolution museums. So you basically teach them how you want to be clean and hygienic and stuff like that during your work and to be healthy. And now, and the museum develops through the Nazi to be this like massive experimental Nazi racist thing of bringing black people and black bodies from Africa and then actually study them and then put them in the museum. And then after that, now the museum is turned to be like kind of a health awareness museum with a space of contemporary art, but it's still a big museum to visit. So to represent the Nazi era, for example, the German, they write, they put a disclaimer in front of any artwork, but you still represent it. So you're still bringing that object there, of a black body. And there was actually two black bodies, from one of them from Sudan and the other one, I think, from Cameroon, and they are represented there with photos. And then you have a disclaimer that actually you say this is part of a racist Nazi project, so I'm distancing myself from it. And it is form of a new othering. It's like kind of othering yourself from it, but you still represent it. This is the place where a massive fascist movement erupting around in Dresden, which is in East Germany. There's a lot of Nazi and Nazi votes, what you call it, the AfD, and popular movement is winning. And what is that museum felt? That disclaimer felt to represent that conflict and history, and actually bringing today problems and integrate movement of today, not integrate social and political movement, but integrate today's story within the museum as a form of movement in a spatial experience that could be a contemporary or spatial design that are created by an artist or a creators who give every human experience to exchange and have knowledge and have a critical knowledge and critical interactive with object that exists, not telling them this is ultimate truth of history, even through disclaimer. And I think this is what I'm thinking about museum that I want to visit. I wanted to have this as a politically critical interactive with objects, not just an object, and then you have a disclaimer. You told me this part of history, and then you have the disclaimer. Maybe I wanted to interact differently with it. So giving us a right, I'm talking about us, about every human that exists today who wanted to practice art or to practice design or whatever, to interact on architect and think tank, like a space to interact with this object in a massive scale and create from it a space where you can create knowledge about an exist conflict in society. So integrate that movement. That's what I'm all the time thinking about future music.
Previously, it was like much. The viewer was in the task of feeling detached, but now the founder or the state museum, whatever, they are in the need of detaching themselves with the collection. But at the end, who owns that collection if we like nobody is part of in that subject? It's very interesting way of thinking. I wasn't clear, but it's just I am processing right now. What do you think, Amal?
No, for me it's because we're so used to a certain way of processing, or curating, whatever kind of exhibition there is in a museum. There's a narrative. Someone creates a narrative. They give you a line towards it, and it's just that narrative. And like even when they're trying to get out of that narrative, they're still creating a narrative. Like when I went to a museum in Amsterdam where they were saying, oh, if you want to see like the colonial history related to these artworks, you can take this path, and then they tell you certain information about it on the app. But it's very interesting because I've not thought of another way where there's not a narrative being created, because it always seems if everyone decides for himself, it could be very intriguing, but at the same time, I'm thinking it could be at some point, I don't want to, like it would be interesting to also have these conversations later of, okay, I interpreted or I understood this from this perspective, but someone could understand it from a different perspective completely. But it's still interesting to have that kind of conversation of how, everyone interprets this, object, and how it can be perceived, instead of having one way of, taking information that is just given, from the curator, historian, or whatever. People can actually experiment with, knowledge creation through, different layers. And then in that way, there's not this idea of this one right interpretation, because there's always this issue also of, like you were saying, of taking out, like creating this narrative of anti-colonialism, but at the same time, it's othering, other elements of it. So for me, it's a very interesting concept to see how it can actually be implemented and have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, I actually, luckily in summer, I participated in a project with Savi actually, and a group of artists called Various and Guild is Roland and Aisha. And this project basically dealing with it's called Momental Shadows. It's about monuments. And so I was kind of in the beginning when I've been invited, I was like, okay, quite skeptical about it, about like what I could do. So we had to work in a statue of Bismarck, the very biggest statue of Bismarck, and coming from history, Bismarck is the one who led, 1885 Berlin conference that divided Africa, and he's one actually symbolic of leadership of colonial history, And so there's Bismarck is like Leopold or other like colonial kings and czars and officers. Like they're very responsible. They're not like isolated from, like they're very responsible of the act of colonialism. But there's different ways. So Leopold, for example, in Belgium, some people brought his statue down, and in also, for example, Roet, I think in South Africa, they brought also his statue, Roet must fall, his statue down. And there was this interview for me. I wasn't sure about, do I want to vandalize, for example, Bismarck statue? I'm not really feeling it. I really don't feel that. Like, I don't feel like going there and vandalize and breaking it and stuff like that. And I also had the thing of like, if we take him out, do is just naively that we pick this brutal part of history and then we cannot have a conversation about it anymore. Because you just take it out from a public space. But it's still, if you keep it there, it still is also representing in a kind of a patriarchal heroic, who's standing there and everybody was celebrating him as a part of the nation creator and nation history. He's also a person who united Germany, he divided Africa and united Germany. Is a very interesting conflict. So what the artist did is, that makes me excited, is basically they cover Bismarck with a cartoon paper work, very colorful. And then during working on it, that it creates a lot of conflict and discussions. Some of it violent, some of it with the police, some of it like, although that the project was permitted by the state, but it was constantly in conversation. Some people come to cheer you up as thinking that you are covering that Bismarck, this ugly whatever. Some people say like, oh, you are covering our nation,
Yeah.
combo. And some of the people actually are coming, you are coloring this asshole, by putting this colorful paper around him. But in every single part of that there's different narrative, and those narratives contradict with the main artistic project, which is mainly, basically, they wanted to dismantle this history, but they want to highlight it at the same time. They wanted to create that conflict. So it's kind of a very interesting project that brought those different narratives in one space and make them collide. And that this could be a prototype for a future museum, how to make narrative collide through an actions toward those particular objects. So you don't make the ground space in Houdini Museum for contemporary art. You let all of the museum um, to be a collide space, a space for colliding narrative, like actually what you said, Amel, which is made me think about this project. But yeah, so another project maybe should just not be linked was Humboldt Forum, which is Humboldt Forum in Berlin. This is a very famous palace rebuilt from Humboldt, and is basically this is a place where there's a lot of conflict because there's a lot of historical artifacts from colonial era that belong to other places and belong to Namibia or belong to Cameroon. And then you have the anti-Humboldt Forum movement, which is asking to bring back all of these artifacts. So Humboldt Forum is running, is working in a very massive exhibition, but it is also embody this power relationship of like German colonial history presented in it's kind of embedded on the space, you know, so, but not embedded negatively without any disclaimer. And then you, most of the time, you have this people protesting in front of Humboldt Forum. So it is important to keep this conflict running. It is important to open the door for the people for anti-Humboldt Forum to be inside because this movement is a social movement and it has a it will grow, it has a development, and then it's in the peak, and then it will fall down, and then it will be a forgotten, and there's still the museum going to be there with some antiques going to go back and some reparation money is going to be brought back to community. But how we can keep that space so that movement has to enter the museum, and this is where this work is shared with you in the museum of the battlefield to start that really speaking nicely about the storming of the Hermitage that during the October Revolution 1917 as a very intro for her work. I could imagine that movement entering the space, but not destroying it, but creating different kind of artistic project uh, that bring this narrative to the exposure to the light space. Yes.
Also, it made me think that maybe for the future it would be possible that shared knowledge and curatorial practice between like how you represent German history in Cameroon Museum in
Yeah.
Cameroon
Yeah.
and how it works in Germany because we are still like more focusing on from the colonial perspective and how they dismantle and make peace with their history. But other side of the coin is, uh, although I don't know much about how it's
Yeah.
already working, but
Yeah.
it can be like part of the social rehabilitation.
Yeah.
But it's like very important how to.
It is interesting that you brought that because there is this conversation about bringing artifacts from Europe, from France, from UK to. There was all the time the question is where we give it back. Like,
Mhm,
okay, if we want to give it back, where? When we. So there was after the building of the Dakar Museum, I think built by the Chinese funding on
mhm,
opened in 2000, I think 18. I remember
mhm,
it was a massive building that's being created, and also it has some kind of the museum itself said to be like in the front line of demanding bringing back the
mhm,
artifact. It is somehow it is there is a conspiracy behind that in a way that I meant conspiracy to make the situation very dramatic in a way. So in general, there is a political power also generates certain kind of nation hierarchies through bringing these artifacts, certain kind of political groups that saying that we built that museum and we brought our stuff back from Europe. Who gonna say that? I think it's also creating a new power relationship. It's not a social movement; it's a political representation of that space, which is sustaining new form of nation state and hierarchy and class privilege for certain kind of people. First, second thing is also it's embodied funny thing about like who funded that. It's like this kind of also this war of civilization. Hampton conspiracy funny thing about like it's funded by Chinese, millions of millions. The Chinese they never cared about art and culture in Africa. They cared about minerals most of the time. But this idea of like we gonna fund this millions of funding and this is the demand to get our artifact and suddenly China started to support. Africa against the colonial movement. It has an economical and material impact on the same state and the social movement and the social group outside. So the museum here is quite a space to be studied that it creates
mhm,
a lot of interest and material impact, class conflict outside the museum space, and also in international political relationship of exploitation. It also has to be addressed in a way. Uh, and in the same time that the artifact is being taking out from Europe that give this idea of what do you call it, the relief, the charity thing that we gave you back your artifacts. So don't talk about colonialism anymore, as this is a conflict with this. So it kind of just make the situation. So I really like think about artifacts to be brought back, but also there is an artistic practice with this artifact has to be done. Inside the space with artifacts being taken. So
Mm,
and we have to admit we are living in a universal world, so we need this conflict to be happening in Berlin as the same is happening in Dakar, it's happening in Khartoum, that we need
true.
that conflict to be brought out to light in a way.
Actually, that question of like who is funding this project is very valid, and these risks and questions should be addressed. I completely agree. But
Yeah,
I am also sometimes concerned, like why they don't let African folks win. Because if you, okay, who to give it back, or if we are just skeptical about who will fund that, you literally don't let them win any portion of their history back. There will be always like some problems.
The idea of, for me, I totally understand the importance of returning objects. This is something I totally agree with to a certain perspective, but I think that this is a question I want to ask is, should the role of museums just be around, objects? Because there's this idea that I've had this discussion continuously for the past few weeks with several people where they say to me, oh, for example, in this place and place, this is the only place that there was heritage civilization because there are, some tangible physical objects that we can see in a museum. And
yeah,
where there's not an acceptance of, any sort of other heritage or the idea of those people had a history before because you don't have that tangibility of objects, although before in a lot of, for example, areas in a lot of African countries, this idea of objects wasn't important because people created and recreated objects, so there was not this idea of maintaining objects. And it also depended on climate. If you're in a place that is more hot like the Sahara, things stay more than in your so shouldn't there be a conversation also about other representations in museums other than, for example, objects where there is like oral history or I don't know, like local concurrent or modern representations of culture? And so I think, isn't that a question that needs to be had also when it comes to this idea of objects are more important, to restitute, to have something in our museums because,
yeah.
there's nothing else now.
Yeah. I think I also agree with that. It's basically I think all the conversation is about to open the museum for integrated movement, like to create a new representations of relationship, not like a concept like relationship between. So basically, and we have a technology now that could actually the storytelling that happened. For example, I don't know if you know Serif Keita, for example, the singer is coming from yeah, Serif Keita is a singer, a Senegalese, sorry, a Malian singer,
Oh, okay.
and it's coming from a Keita family, and Keita family is a storytellers basically, and he's singing as a storyteller. And this is an artifact. This is not an artifact. This is an object. This is history and has to be kind of pro. But in the past, we didn't have we didn't have a recording system. No, we need to have. We can record the stories now or present in a museum. But I
Mm-hmm.
think about the objects because objects now from this Eurocentric perspective, object this is a preservation of objects. The antique shop and the museum. No, so you have that place where you put an object, you isolate it from the social relationship, from the environment, and then put it in the space and put a light on it, and you give that place, you give that object the power, and that's through that object tell story, create the nation, tell identity, and so on. So there is a need that object is the most place that we need to attack constantly. The object is space, the preservation is space of history. To attack constantly, I don't mean by attacking it, destroying it, but attacking it critically. And be allowed to re-manipulate those objects to redefine the constant movement of identities. So the constant movement that culture is not a static, it's a movement. And then we could actually open a part of like object manipulation that could be brought to space, other stage of performativity art, performer art, technological art, media art, that is actually could give that the object to be manipulated by different artwork happening through the space of the museum and all other museums. So I think for now, maybe we are shooting inside the object space, but the museum, I agree with you, has to open for all form of representations, and all form of representations also has to be discussed critically in that. Yeah, yeah. So that what I'm thinking about. Yeah, and I think also part of it is because now, if we want to go in a way that, because I'm actually not, I don't want to also to be dreaming, because the curatorial, so the Binali's, the contemporary art spaces that created as a counter to preserve art and conservative art museums, and then to represent contemporary art, they also enter a problematic path now, for example, of the narrative that we were telling about that. And this is, so for example, there was this story of Venice. I mean, I don't know if you have heard about it. Venice Biennale, that they so when you enter the Biennale, you have this boat, a refugee boat. So basically, I think a Danish or Irish artist, European artist, took a boat that sank in the Red Sea with, I think, around 300 migrants died in that boat, and took it and presented in a contemporary art to highlight, under what he said, to highlight the story of of migrations and refugee as a political issue of today. But what actually he did, he created something very, as people come to celebrate that massive massacre that happened to people. It's like, I think, who was talking about it? I think David Greva was talking about that, as well, about it turned it as a place of like a tomb of, it's not a place to highlight because people drinking around that object, wine, and celebrating art and very happy of meeting each other. It's kind of a high, big feast of death. Celebrating the killing. It's like Viking, massive feasting of killing the others or killing the migrants. And this is the place of contemporary art. Through bringing the narrative of justice, egalitarian, and everything, you have created that space. So there is a need to. There is I think, the critical approach to museum, because a museum, often some museum, modern museum, contemporary art spaces that often museum has to be entered, the critique has to enter that space as well. And we need to also admit that contemporary curatorial projects like Binali are not sufficient enough to counter museums. They had a problems on them, embodied on them, that the power relations, the economic, political power relations that had. And I think this comes to Ezra, what she said about like this thing about like what is the Cameroonians themselves or the Senegalese themselves to rediscuss their art spaces. I think it comes to idea of like just there's stories of migrations by refugees. There's a lot of refugees within those boats who are artists and designers and whatever. Just let them do their artwork instead of bringing an Irish artist to come and represent this story and get happy with it. So we're bringing this boat of feasting and uh, yeah. So
And I think
I think there is also lots of operational gaps and problems coming through. It's like that would be possible if only the curatorial direction would already willing to represent that, or they just choose between like among what's available.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting also to reach a point where, like I was asking in point, is there ever going to be a point where, I don't know, Sudan has British artifacts or art pieces that they want to represent and have that kind of conversation? Because, for example, in the museum in Sudan, there's a head of Augustus that was found under the throne of Queen Amenhotep. She took the statue, cut off the head, put it under her throne to show her power. And it was found in Sudan 200 years ago. And in Sudan, we only have the replica of that statue. The actual head of the statue is in a museum in the UK. And it's always like that with the power dynamics that you say, like, even when I see the way, for example, the museum, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi is, and what type of pieces are sent to, Abu Dhabi, and how much there's a control, and is there any, space also for like curators from the UAE to have a conversation about, what pieces to bring. And so it's also interesting from that perspective of, trying to kind of not flip the narrative, but have it from a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the story of Augustus and Amali Shikera is like I actually read it on the internet. I actually didn't see that, and in a way that, but also I had this. Let's speak personally. When I saw the photo, I had this sense of like, but it also bring us to the beginning of conversation of like, what kind of civilization I'm celebrating? Am I celebrating? Am I looking at the woman that led the Nubian
Yeah,
civilization?
exactly.
So my when I see that photo, like the hair of my, it's like, oh, I'm very proud of my civilization and stuff like that.
And
And
it brings us, yeah.
yeah. So, but I think part of this story itself, it is so far away that we can not engage in a conversation about it, like
Mm.
critical conversation about it. If that object stays still in the space that it is, that we need now, I think this is also part of this, what you call it, like economical, political, artistic division that we have, that we, so, you have this, the global south seeking to have their national representation back, and we don't have the chance to look at this national representation critically, which kind of correlation represent the Nile civilization, which has continued to carry the power in Sudan until now. It's about like, what's the Man Shakita relationship with the Tajo and Tunjo? I don't know, is it the same time, not the same time? What's the relationship with the minority of the South, with his Alex?
Exactly.
It's very, very, very big, but we don't have that chance to discuss this because we have a fight of like, bring our artifact back, or and so, or like whatever British artists they engage in this project critically, but we just have it far away. I think it is kind of a, that is make us maybe think about future museum of the universality, that itself, that instead of bringing the artifact, maybe we can just, if we agree, because if we talk about future, still with borders and nation and stuff like that, let's be not, for example, dreamy, be rational. Let make the museum as a space where access to it, put the airplane on it, whatever it is, I don't know, but like, it has to be isolated from the nation. It has to be
Yeah.
universal representation. If they want to keep these artifacts there, just, don't make a visa to enter that museum. Put it in the hill up there and put a tunnel toward it. But actually, my way is basically leave people to move, whatever. Borders is shut. But I meant in that place that if you admit the museum has a universal representation, then give it a universal access. So some new projects talking about digital access to museum, which is, it brings us to the aura about the Benjamin conversation about the age of museums in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is an old whole conversation about, is the artwork in the digitality, or the representation of the mechanical representation, like photography, or the artwork is to represent the artwork itself, is that the museum that physically has to be accessed. And I think it's another conversation about like, what is the digital role on representing those artwork, and in the future, because what we're going to see is not about, we're going to see is like, they just make a massive virtual reality and they just send it to Sudanese CPUs, whatever, people in computers to watch that. We don't have to come there. You can just watch it from your computer. It's a very silent British accent in a way. So, you get my point. So there is a
Yeah, yeah.
conversation now about
But
having access to museum through digital solution, and that place where it has to be also criticized somehow.
But I also think it, because it kind of takes people out of like, it makes it easy for them, instead of having to have a conversation of like, okay, you're saying the museum is universal. And so I don't think I explained it clearly, but for me it's like, if we trying to move on from the point of, restitute and art pieces, because we're saying it's ours, and to reach a point of having, artwork or pieces from all over the world, to have a conversation about that. And so
Yeah.
instead of us being in Sudan, like, oh, we just want to get the stuff back, and then having a conversation of, smaller communities who say, like, okay, this isn't supposed to be Sudanese. And this is a conversation I had 2 weeks ago of, okay, this piece belongs to our northern tribe, this place, which we can't have that. And in the end, I told them we can't have this conversation because we don't know what 2,000 years ago looked like. So we can't, clearly have a conversation about who owns what, because then I don't even know if my ancestors come from that point. And we had that conversation. But then to be like museums, to be a space where people can have real conversation, then there could be like pieces. Of course, there's going to always be the economical and security, point of, oh, your museums can't protect this or that. But in the future, where like it just being digitally would make it easier for, the pieces to be in one museum somewhere, and where people can't really have conversations about, different narratives related to them.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe there's different ideas. Maybe we could talk about it ironically. We could talk about it seriously in a way that, for example, that if we have a detailed replica for artworks or detailed space for conversation, so we need to agree to bury, for example, the to bury it somewhere in a neutral water. Kind of, that, but meant ironically, but also critically, that instead of the detailed replica is also, that with photography, for example, we had all over the world the photo of what's called like a Burj Evil, what do you call it? Evil Tower, how you call it?
Yeah.
How you call it in one in Paris?
Torre,
This,
the Eiffel Tower.
yeah, yeah. So basically, the funny thing that you have this mechanical production. Everybody has this photo in their house. You go to Khartoum, you have Burj Evil, you have samples of it. They have some kind of mechanical reproduction of it. Everybody has it. But that made the actual model more powerful. The detailed replicas, it create it kind of create them that which shows us right? Like the mechanical replica and detailed replica create more strong aura in the artifact itself or the artwork itself that exists. So if we want to create a detailed replica that everybody had access to it, then we have to dismantle the one in the center, because the one in the center get more powerful. But I meant it is just like in a way that to look at these things in a critical engagement and conversation somehow. But then it brings us all the time the discussion about the museum or the discussion about the artwork. It's gonna take us to the space around it, outside of the museum. Is accessibility to that space, the accessibility to that space, and that makes us, if we want to engage in a museum conversation, we have to engage in also social political conversation about like who have access to that space. And then it brings us to the situation of, for example, Marcel in France. Is it a French, or it is a representative legacy of colonial history? Senegalese soldiers fought there in that place. But accessibility to space, and we have a political justification of like, hey, just let people come wherever they want to go, and that the museum movement itself, then the museum could be representation of universal space if everybody have access to it. Not the discussion already happened inside, bringing, for example, um, mostly a lot of privileged artists who have access to museums, to talk about Nubian artifacts in UK, and they're also Sudanese, for example, from Khartoum. But actually, whatever Nubian tribe exists, they don't have access to that thing, and they don't have access to digital spaces. So it is kind of the question of the future itself is a social political dimension around the museum itself. Who have the access to it, and yeah, I also work in digitality and augmented reality, virtual reality stuff as to ease the access, but they are not a solution at all. They just make the access, for temporary, being that you give the people the experience to experience space through virtual reality. But it is somehow it's equally problematic because it's technology and it needs CPU and it needs graphic cards and it needs computers, and who have that and who is producing that and who have the money and the economical power to give this digital, creating a digital architecture. And this take us to another conversation. Who is it? Digital architecture is owned by people, owned by massive amount of people. Technology is owned by people. And as much as I am a user for that space, some people generate money from my accessibility. It's not a neutral space. It's not like Earth. I'm not. It's not a land. It's not a neutral land that I'm entering. It's called the internet and the digital. It is quite. And this, I think, is kind of taking us out of our scene a little bit, but also good to touch it in a way.
But I think that futuristic approaches are really important to tackle
Yeah.
it. And also, Ahmed mentioned that in the East world, like let's say, what is Nubian, what is Sudanese, but you say we don't reach that point of discussion because we are just demanding back. But I think this discussion specifically should be parallel
Yeah.
because like sometimes conversations with the movement, like
Yeah.
after Floyd, Black Lives Matter, become something else. Sometimes it's just jump into another level, and we might reach that, like calling being Western is okay, but then internal power dynamics will be as problematic as before. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
should go like hand in hand. And
Yeah.
yeah, most of the time the case is like
Yeah.
colonialist imperialism is like very internal problem at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. We need to have this conversation all the time, and we need to have this conversation as we own that spaces. I think there is a part of get liberated from the constraints of Eurocentric visions of being all the time in the American, just trying to think sometimes of like how we gonna do it when we're at the center. I think this is a very remind me of Fanon talking in the he has in part of Fanon approach is that exactly, during the decolonial era. And he has this chapter he was talking about in The Wretch of the Heirs. He was talking about US, that as the US of example of a continent that in that time he wrote a book in 1968, that a continent that took the path of decolonialization as they so called, and then they turned to be this massive imperial power that invaded Vietnam. And so, because during this process, that engaging in active conversation and look at yourself as a winner in the end of the game, it's meant that you need to have a critical conversation about yourself, with your commerce, and with your existence, cultural coexistence in a way that think about the future. And I think this is one of the base problem of narrative and decolonialization when it comes to museum, because we have a massive, what do you call it, marginalized social movement that talking about taking over and having a new narrative, but they are not engaging constantly critical. We also reserved our positions as to be the right narrative. We are the victim. We're going to take over and we're going to be fine. But it's not true. I think there is to think about future narrative. We need to think about ourselves critically, like to look at what is the Nubian civilization. What's happened. I think there's a lot of conversation has to happen about the museum in Egypt now, the one that they opened,
Yeah.
and what that actually represent and what the Sisi represent with that museum and the work, massive work. There's a lot of people happy and celebrating that space, but that space is as problematic as shit, like has to be discussed about it and why. Yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. We need to engage in those active conversation um, without going to prison also as well.